I'm Jan Holden. I'm a professor of counseling at the University of North Texas, and I'm really pleased to be here today with Paula Lenz, who will be talking actually for most of this presentation. I'm going to offer a little introduction, though. The way that I came to know Paula is that one day I was sitting in my office at University of North Texas, and my phone rang, and we both marvel at the fact that I actually was there to answer my phone. And Paula was on the other end. We had never met. She was actually calling me because she was trying to get in touch with Ken Ring, who's a veteran near-death experience researcher. And we got to talking and ended up talking for, I think, like an hour and a half. And after which, Paula sent me the draft of her book, Driving into Infinity. And I recognized in her experience something very interesting. My research agenda at UNT these past 30 years has been primarily near-death experiences, but really transpersonal experiences in general. Those are experiences that transcend the usual personal limits of space, time, and identity. And so in more recent years, I've been focusing also on after-death communication. And in Paula's experience, I saw a phenomenon that could not easily be categorized. It is a combination of a shared death experience, which is where a living person in their psychological experience accompanies a dying person in the first moments of death, but then, of course, the living person comes back. And an after-death communication where a living person has a sense of communication with I prefer to say disembodied person, someone who has died. And so I just was very interested in her experience because it was this sort of crossover combination experience. So I asked her if she'd be willing to actually complete the near-death experience scale, which is an instrument that Bruce Grayson developed many years ago to assess the presence and depth of a near-death experience. And the scale, you can score anywhere from 0 to 32 points. And Paula agreed to do it. She returned her scale responses to me. And to my interest, she scored 20, which is quite high. 7 is considered to be a minimum score to confirm the presence of a near-death experience. So she scored 20 on this scale, indicating, excuse me, quite a profound experience. And so then as we talked more, I learned more about after effects that had occurred to her as a result that she attributed to this experience. And so I wanted to promote her opportunity to share her experience with you today. And after she has finished talking with you for probably 25 or 30 minutes, I'll come back and we'll talk about after effects that the experience has had. She'll touch on some of them just naturally, but we'll come back and focus on them quite purposefully, and then still have time for questions, comments, and maybe other experiences that some of you have had that you may find similarity in what Paula tells you about. So without further ado, here is Paula Lenz.
Thank you so much, Dr. Holden. It's really an honor to be here today. I'm very excited to be able to share my story here. So this year marks 35 years since my brother Don transitioned from his earthly life. I'm the oldest in the family. My brother was 4 years younger than me, and as a result, we grew up together and shared really our childhood memories. I do have a sister who's 10 years younger. but obviously our experiences are vastly different together in terms of growing up. But at the urging of some of my very closest friends, I finally shared my story with the world about living with my brother's spirit. Last September, I finally published my book called Driving into Infinity. And my thanks to Dr. Holden for generously providing her time to write the afterword and talk about the research. As I explain in my book, we are not forgotten by those we have loved, and they do visit us more times than we consciously know. I hope that my story provides some comfort to those who have experienced the loss of someone they love deeply. I say thank you to Dr. Kenneth Ring, for one of the IANDS founders, for writing his book in 1985. It was called Heading Toward Omega. And he included an experience there by a woman named Nancy Clark. Now, she did not have a near-death experience. It was the only type of experience he included in that book. But I found for the first time ever this experience that was somewhat similar in nature to my experience. And this was the first time I had been able to find anything like that. And I felt as though Dr. Ring saved me by having this book and providing her experience. And I also thank him for his time to have reviewed my book and provide this wonderful endorsement quote. Journey back in time with me now. The year is 1982, and that was years before the internet was available. Most offices didn't even have computers. There might have been one or two somewhere. And certainly, no one had anything like a personal cell phone at that time. Now, I was 29 years old at the time, and I began having a dream that recurred from the fall of 1982 until the fall of 1983. This dream was always the same. I would be outside on some rolling hills, and there were people gathering there on the hillside. And soon more and more people came until there were actually throngs of people there. And at that moment, then someone walked up to me and asked me, "What's going on here?" And I said, "I've heard that it's the end of the world." And when I said that, in my dream, in the sky there appeared Jesus. But at the moment that Jesus appeared in the sky, I suddenly doubled over in pain. But this pain was not physical pain. It was heartfelt suffering and agony that was beyond words. And as I was experiencing this terrible pain, I thought to myself, but it isn't supposed to be this way. I thought that the end of the world was supposed to be joyous. I had absolutely no idea what this dream meant. And every single time I had it, as it ended, I would be startled awake. Now, fast forward to the morning of Friday, October the 7th, 1983. That morning, I was driving my husband to his office, and we were meeting later at a festival near downtown Houston, the Greek festival. And as I'm driving, all of a sudden, I developed this sharp pain over my heart area. I happened to glance at the clock, and it said 9 a.m. I was really frightened by this experience because I thought, am I having a heart attack? Do I have a blood clot? What's going on here? The pain was very intense, but I didn't say anything to my husband. I just went ahead and dropped him off. And after about 15 minutes, the pain finally began to subside. And I drove on downtown, joined my friends at the Greek Orthodox Church where the Greek festival is held each year. And after a while, so we were outside first at the festival, but part of the festival is also in the annex area of the Greek Orthodox Church. So we had gone inside to get some lunch. There were throngs of people in there. It was shoulder to shoulder. It's a very popular festival in the Houston area. And I happened to look up and I see my husband coming toward me, making his way through the crowd. And I thought, well, he's here kind of early. He wasn't supposed to get here till later. But as he got closer, I could see his face. And I knew that something was terribly wrong. I had never seen him look like that. And as he came up to me, he put both his hands on my arms, and he looked me right in the eyes, and he said, Donnie was killed this morning in an accident. And as he said those words, I just got this mental image of a picture of the earth just falling, 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 and just shattering at my feet. And then I just doubled over and was screaming, no, no, no. I then learned that Donnie's fatal accident had happened around 9 a.m. that morning. That was exactly the time that I felt that terrible pain over my heart area. So I knew that he had reached out some way to me, from his spirit to me, with this pain over my heart. And it was that day, too, that I understood what my dream had been trying to tell me. First of all, it was showing me the setting, because I was at this festival that was outside, and there were, crowds and crowds of people there. And then Jesus appearing in the sky, related it to some religious aspect. And this was held at the Greek Orthodox Church. And finally, the dream was trying to show me what my emotional reaction was going to be. But again, I had no reference point to know what did all those things relate to in the dream. And prior to that, I had never had any precognitive dreams at all. My feelings over this loss, I was completely destroyed. My brother and I were very close. We always kept in touch. And I just didn't know that a human being could cry so many tears for so long. Let me read from the book, description of some moments from that time. Every moment was sheer agony during those days, with no words to adequately describe a broken heart. Nothing made sense, and everything about life was dark. I barely slept. I moved in a daze. I wanted to die every day. This terrible, impenetrable wall now separated me from ever having contact with my beloved brother again. How do you process that fact and integrate it into your life? I could not. At the burial site, I wondered how I could possibly continue living after this. Now, 3 days after my brother's funeral, Donnie came back to me while I was driving. And I was actually driving his small personal truck because uh, his accident had occurred in a company truck. And I was actually in Bryan, which is my hometown. And I was staying on to help my parents with some things following the funeral. And that day, I decided to take Donnie's truck and drive to my grandparents' home, which is about 10 or 15 minutes out of town, to take them some of the funeral flowers. And as I'm driving, I'm about halfway to my grandparents' home, and suddenly I realize that I'm seeing everything around me, 360-degree vision. And I'm driving and I'm startled. I'm trying to figure out what's happening to me. And then I realized that my brother was at my right shoulder. And he looked like a pattern of light, but it was still him. I could recognize him. And he began to speak telepathically to me. Now, I'm still driving along here, but he told me not to be sad, that he was happy, and he wanted me to know what it was like for him now. And what he did is he explained to me that he was on another plane of being, and that it had really just simply been time for him to go. Then I realized that I was no longer in my body. I was no longer driving the truck. And what I saw at first was a landscape, but it reminded me of looking at a negative of a photograph. And I really didn't see that for very long. And then that kind of faded away. And at that point, it was all about focusing on peace, eternity, infinity. And the very first thing I did experience was this peace that completely overtook me. And the thought came to my mind of the Bible verse of the peace that passeth understanding. Next, I realized that I knew everything in the universe, that I knew all knowledge for all times. And this was astonishing to me. And this was all part of the realm of being in infinity and experiencing that as well as this knowledge. And then I experienced this wave of love, this energy, this powerful energy. And as you've heard from other people here, presentations, I'm sure, this love is so far beyond what we term as love here. It's really all-encompassing. And I knew at that point, when this love encompassed me, I knew that I was one with this spirit, which is what I call it in the book, this powerful energy of love, spirit, that I was one with this, and that I was one with all knowledge. It wasn't that I just knew about it. I was one with that. The same with the peace. I became one with the peace. And I knew that everything, everyone, but everything in the entire universe, that we are all one. I could feel that, and I understood it, and I was that. And the feeling I had about that was, I'm home. This is where I belong. And when I experienced these things, then I began to realize that I really did not care one thing about returning to my body. I knew I was out of my body. I didn't want to go back to my body. I wanted to go higher. I wanted to go to the next level. And my brother was still with me this whole time. This really at my, the right shoulder area. And when I began thinking about moving on and staying here, I began to feel as though I was whooshing away. That was the feeling that I got, and the sound of whooshing. And as that began to happen, and I was moving very rapidly, my brother says to me, "No, you can't go yet. It's not your time." And it was as though he exerted his energy on me, and he began pushing me back down toward my body. And I could see my body, and I could see myself coming back into my body. So I landed, I'll say, somewhat with a thud back in my body. And the first thought I had was, oh my God, I'm so confined in this body. And, but I felt so at peace. And I was happy that my brother was still alive. I knew he was alive and around. And I really felt happy and peaceful. But the other thought I had was, wow, I've made a turn onto the road that takes me to my grandparents' house. And to this day, I have no recollection of driving the truck or making the turn. So make of that what you will, because I don't know who was driving. But I went on to my grandparents' house, and I didn't say anything about my experience, but it was amazing to me how I had such a different view of them and the grief that they had, because I knew that everything was okay with my brother. And after that experience, my life, my consciousness, my view of life could never be the same. I was completely changed. Now, I never had any additional out-of-body experiences with my brother, but for the rest of my life, these last 35 years, I have continued to have after-death communications from him. And there have been other strange events and some after effects, which Dr. Holden's going to talk about. But some of the additional outreach I had from him, my home back in Sugar Land, I did see him in my living room one day. It was only for a second, but it was him. And he looked as he did when he lived with us one summer. And actually, he wasn't even looking at me. He was standing in the living room and peering into our stereo cabinet while I'm over in the hallway seeing him do this. But it was so typical of him, because when he lived with us, he was always playing different things at the stereo. Also, during that time he stayed with us, there was always a particular chair he sat in at our dining room table. And for the rest of the years that we lived in that house in Sugar Land, I would come home from work. Every couple of days, that chair was pulled out from the dining room table. Now, we didn't even go in there most of the time. We ate at a different little table in the breakfast area. So that was really strange and in fact, I had asked my husband at one point, was he going in there to do something? And he said, no, absolutely not. Also, another time, my husband and I were watching TV in one of the rooms. And as we're sitting there, a video flew out from a bookcase. Now, this flew out from the very top shelf. And it didn't just fall to the ground. It flew out and landed at our feet. And my husband and I looked at each other like, what just happened here? Another time when I was walking toward the hallway in our house, I saw a book lying on the floor. It was up against the wall. Directly across from that wall was a built-in bookcase. And you could see where this book had come from. It had come from the shelf that was at carpet level. So it was obvious that this book had to have actually flown across the hallway because it was still up against the opposite wall. Another time I was walking into our master bedroom, and a chair had been placed right in the middle of the doorway. Now, that time I was a little scared. I had come home from work, and I actually thought someone had gotten into the house, and I searched the whole place, but nothing else was amiss at that time. Additionally, my dad and his wife related to me that at night they would hear in their kitchen the microwave buttons sounding, and they felt sure that it was Donnie letting them know that he was there. Now, my mother related to me that not too long after my brother's death, she had a dream, and my brother came to her in a dream, but he was in the form of a young deer. But she knew, she told me, she said, I knew it was Donnie, even though he was in as a young deer. The deer came up to her and she said, son, you need to come back to me now. And he looked at her and he said, Mama, I can't. I'm happy where I am. And she said again to him, son, I really need for you to come home. And he just said, Mama, I can't. And with that, he turned and he walked away. But my mother said that what happened was, as he walked away, he took with him out of her heart the worst anguish and agony that she had been experiencing since his death. And she said, he took that with him. And she said, from then on, she said, although I remained sad about the loss, she said, I was able to go on living and not have this terrible agony in my heart anymore. And I also believe that a couple of months after my brother's passing, that I received guidance from him, and that related to saving my family and me from the brink of death by carbon monoxide poisoning. Now, there are many more incidents in the book described in a lot more detail, but obviously I can't go over all of them. But I believe that you can understand why I named my book Driving into Infinity, because my brother was driving the truck at the time of his passing. I was driving at the time I had that terrible pain over my heart, and then I was driving his truck at the time I had this out-of-body experience with him. Now, integrating this experience into my life has taken many years, because this was not a story that I shared with people. I had a couple of very close friends who knew some of these stories about some of the things that had happened, but this was not a part of my life that I ever really talked about. So, writing this book and sharing my story has really opened the way for me to really potentially help other people who have experienced this kind of loss. And by doing this, I have been able to become an authentic person, a whole person, because this has always been an integral part of my life. But I just felt I couldn't share it with anyone. I felt like people would think I was crazy. Now, I've had a 40-year career, and I've been a businesswoman for a long time, and I was a community leader, and the thought of telling people about this was just not something I wanted to do. But by finally doing this, it's just opened up my whole life for really, as I said, feeling like a whole person again. And the other part is that sharing these experiences via my book has really resulted in some amazing and meaningful moments with people. For example, I had gone into a ski shop looking to buy some new ski boots, and the owner there, I felt guided to tell him I had written this book. And as I talked to him a little about my story, tears welled up in his eyes, and he said, "I can't believe that you have walked into my ski shop." He said, "I lost my 21-year-old daughter a year ago." And he said, "I'm very interested to know more about what you've said." And the same type of thing happened when I went to my doctor's office and I was talking with a nurse. Same kind of deal. Her brother-in-law had just passed, and her whole family was really in the throes of this deep tragedy. And not very long ago, I attended a class reunion, high school reunion. A lot of my high school classmates knew that I had published the book, and in fact, I had returned to my hometown for a book signing event because everyone said, "Hey, when you come back to Texas, well, we'd like to have that." So I had set that up. And one of the classmates, I just chatted with him, found out he actually lives in Colorado where we are. And, he didn't seem overly interested in the book, and we didn't talk that long. But the next day, at the book signing, Bill was his name, Bill comes up to me. He's like the first person there. And he said, "Paula, I just had to come here to the book signing and talk to you in person again." He said, "After we chatted at the dinner last night," he said, "I went home, I found your book, I downloaded it, and I read the whole thing last night." He said, "When I was 19, my 21-year-old brother was murdered." He said, "Now I have a younger brother." But he said, "For some reason, our parents did not allow us to go to the funeral." And he said, "I have experienced issues and problems for the rest of my life related to this loss of my brother." And he said, "I just wanted to tell you that I totally understand a lot of the things that you said and shared." And he said, "It has been so important to me to read this book and to hear the things that you have written about." He said, "I just had to come here in person and thank you." I was completely blown away by that. The other way of integrating this experience into my life is regarding greater understanding of the eternity and the oneness of our lives. And this has resulted in gifts that really have enriched my life as a result of my experience. And that's having really heightened intuition and knowing about people and events in my life. I also experience and recognize the synchronicity of events and people that are part of my life, and I'm sure a part of your life. I also engage in what I call the meld into spirit technique, or MIST, and I do talk about that in my book. It's a way for me to, each and every day, to consciously connect with spirit. And it's not necessarily that you have to sit there and be meditating. I like to think of it as a way that you can do this wherever you are. Additionally, I focus on what I call conscientious consciousness. And if you look at that individually, the definition of consciousness. It's the quality or state of being aware, especially of something within oneself, the knowledge of one's own existence. Consciousness is the quality or state of being aware. Quality or state of being aware, especially of something within oneself. Being conscientious is faithful, careful, particular, and industrious and diligent. The message from conscientious consciousness is greater fulfillment each day in our lives. By consciously opening to this magnificent energy, this powerful spirit of love. And what I learned from my experience is that we're all within that right now, right here, right now, every day. And it's not something that you have to wait to be able to connect to. It's here. But we just have to open to that consciously to connect with it and let that into our lives and bring about miracles, really. I just want to leave you with a few thoughts here from the Buddha Metta meditation. May I be at peace. May my heart remain open. May I awaken to the light of my own true nature. May I be healed. May we be a source of healing for each other. But most of all, I want to thank everyone here for allowing me this opportunity to share my story with you. To me, that's what matters. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paula. Come on, stay up on the stage with me
Okay.
so we can talk about. I know that you mentioned several. I just want to draw some parallels between Paula's experience and near-death experiences, and to illustrate the commonality between various spiritually transformative experiences. Your experience involved peace, love, and all knowledge. And so that very close parallel to a near-death experience, which makes sense because your brother was sharing with you what he had experienced. So it was like you were experiencing his near-death experience. And you mentioned some after effects, but I wonder if you might go into more detail about any other after effects that you attribute to this experience, ways that you perceive yourself to have been different after this experience that was due to it.
Sure. Need a microphone. There we go.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Well, one of the things I noticed is when I would drive on the freeway or streets, or walk for that matter also, street lights would go out as I got near them. I mean, I've driven on the freeway before and just watched street lights go out as I drive by, but also in walking.
Yeah.
I still have that happen every now and again.
Okay, so hang on, and let me just say that one of the things we know now is that in the aftermath of near-death experiences and other spiritually transformative experiences, people manifest what we call electromagnetic after effects, and electronic devices in their vicinity malfunction. And it's been established through a few different studies, not only questioning NDEers and other STEers themselves, but also their loved ones. And an example is a gal I spoke with who had a near-death experience, and we were talking about the after effects, and I mentioned the electromagnetic, and she was like, oh, and it's interesting because this is probably an after effect that I would say rather commonly near-death experiencers don't connect, that what they've been experiencing it's only by realizing the connection and thinking back that they realize it all started with their NDE. But a lot of NDEers can't wear watches because the battery dies. And in her case, she and her partner had bought a TV, and her partner complained that whenever she was in the room, the channels would flip and the volume would go up and down, and nobody was anywhere near the remote. And he said, it's only when you're in there. And so that it all then made sense to her. So and the lights, street lights going out is something that NDEers fairly frequently report. Yeah.
Well, another aspect after my experience was I felt I was on this quest, which continues even now, to read everything I could possibly find in relation to spirituality and even religions and practices and just the whole realm related to that. And I have probably since 1983, again, I didn't have the internet to go to figure out anything about what had happened to me. And literally, I probably have read hundreds and hundreds of books since that time on just every kind of subject related to that whole realm. And the odd thing about that is I was an English major. And the other thing that really happened was I no longer had any interest whatsoever in reading anything that was fictional. After having been an English major.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so that's another common after effect is NDEers become very, very interested in spirituality and really often describe going on a quest for knowledge about spiritually related phenomena. Mm-hmm.
I did develop more precognitive dreams thereafter.
Mm.
And I also learned to read people's auras. Now, I took a class at Unity for that, but I do have the ability to read people's auras. Mm-hmm. And I had a really significant experience related to that. A friend of mine worked for me at a company in 2001. She and another guy who worked for me. One day I said to them, I can read auras. You guys want your auras read just for fun? And they're like, yeah, sure. So I read the guy's aura, and his looked great. It was, bright and bright yellow and looked good. But when I read her aura, it was muddy and murky looking. And I had never seen anyone's aura look like that. So I didn't know what to think about that. And I told her, I said, well, I see this being murky. I just don't know what it means. But in my mind, I was thinking, well, this can't be good. Anyway, she ended up 3 weeks later going into intensive care for like 10 weeks. And eventually she recovered. And I told her, I said, well, maybe it was just some energy blockages. When she returned to work, she went to a JMT practitioner, Jaffe Miller technique. And when she returned, I said, well, come in and tell me, how did that work out? That was for clearing energy blockages. And she came into my office, she sat down, and she starts telling me about the experience. And all of a sudden, I mean, just spontaneously, this huge aura develops around her. It was purple. And most of the time when you see people's auras, they're transparent. This was not. It was not transparent. And it was absolutely huge around her body. And I'm sitting there dumbfounded. And also, as she's talking to me, I am just weeping uncontrollably. My eyes just were flowing. And she's kind of looking at me, and I said, "You have to stop. I don't know what's happening here. I've never had this happen at all." I kind of told her what I was seeing, and I said, "Why don't you go to your office and call me?" And as soon as she walked out, my eyes stopped watering. But when she called me on the phone, and I picked up the phone, immediately when she started talking, I started having the flow of tears again. And I believe that, well, she became a Reiki master after that. She became a healer. And it was like I saw the day that she began getting her powers. That was an amazing experience.
Wow, interesting. So in retrospect, it almost sounds like the illness that she went through is in shamanic tradition. There's often an initiation of a crisis that leads to the opening for healing potential. So, I mean, just one possible perspective. Okay.
I do have energetic sensitivity. You know, if I walk into a room, I can feel different energy levels. Perhaps the best example of that is I went to a stupa at what's called the Shambhala Mountain Center in Colorado. And I'd never been to a stupa. I didn't really know what to expect. But I walked in, and I'd been in there about a minute, and suddenly it was just like as though water were filling up this stupa, because I felt the energy coming up from the floor and just going all the way to the ceiling. You know, there's this giant statue of a Buddha in there. And I was amazed because I said, wow, this place has some powerful energy. Let's see. Initially, too, after my experience, I could hear people's thoughts when they walked into the room. Now, eventually that diminished, seemed to go away, but I'm finding that now that I'm spending more time, you know, not working all the time, being retired and more focused on this, that some of those kinds of abilities are returning, as well as developing visions of some things that are coming into my life. And the other aspect I would mention too is that after having had this experience, and again, you don't look at the world the same way, and my view of humanity, mankind, was how can we live like this, being so cruel to each other and hurtful, even through all the ages. And, you know, for example, these religious wars, you know, that are done in the name of God. And to me, it's just so out of the realm of this spirit of love and what we really are all about and connected to. And the other aspect, too, at this stage of my life, after having had a long career, is I noticed that the career positions I loved the most were those where I allowed my passion to flow in the tasks that were required by my job. And, you know, I had love and passion for that, and it just flowed. And I worked really hard, but it didn't feel like that. It just felt like I was spinning energy, and it was just creating in front of me. And I attribute that to really being in the flow of that spiritual aspect of love coming through for what you do. And I think that's a big realization here at the end of my career. And something I think people need to realize when you connect with your passion for your career, what you're doing in life, it's so rewarding because it fills you with joy and you have that fulfillment and it doesn't become work or drudgery. Mm-hmm. And too many times people just settle for something less than that.
Yeah, thank you. You're affirming what has been my mantra in life, which is follow your bliss.
Exactly.
Yeah. Very good. So you mentioned some precognitive dreams. The pattern you described about hearing people's thoughts and then that diminishing, but then as you've cultivated your connection to the spiritual domain, that ability is coming back. That's a kind of a pattern that I've heard some near-death experiencers say as well.
Interesting.
So there are a lot of parallels.
I'm learning too.
Yeah. So I think that is there anything else you wanted to say?
No, I think you pointed out.
Yeah,
Most
me
of the
too.
ones.
I think we're good. So we're ready for if you have questions, comments, anything you want to ask or say. We're interested to hear. Yes. I guess they're going to put the microphone there. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing your story. 2 months ago, I was going through some difficult times and somebody handed me a book about a brother, The Afterlife of Billy Fingers. I think you're probably familiar with it. And now I'm hearing your story. It's amazing that brothers can share this with their sisters, maybe because of your sensitivity. Could you just speak a little more about the relationship with your brother that might have allowed you to be open to hearing his message and changing your life and all of ours?
That's a great comment, because in my book I do go into detail trying to develop for the reader a picture about who my brother was and our relationship. And there are some really funny stories in there, especially growing up. My brother wanted to hang with me when I was hanging out with my friends. And, I was always like, oh, I just want to get rid of him, And he was just a really, really funny guy. He could imitate anyone. And honestly, that brings to mind an experience I had with him about a couple of months before his passing. As we had visited Brian and we were leaving, I gave him a hug goodbye, and when I hugged him, I just had come into my mind, oh, Donnie, you are so much the center of our family. And that is really how it was in our family. He was just so funny, and every time we got together, we all ended up, rolling on the floor laughing. He was full of joy. He had a number of really close friends, and they also, even to this day, it's very hard for them to talk about Donnie being gone, because that's just the kind of guy he was. Funny, kind, everybody really loved Donnie. And it's been rewarding to me in terms of the book signing I had in my hometown, all the comments, and actually getting together with some of his longtime friends and kind of reliving some of those moments, those funny times with Donnie. So there are quite a few stories, but we did have our childhood memories. We would get outside and make mud pies together, and I remember one time we flew a kite, and it was way far away out in a field, and we ran across this long field out in the country to retrieve our kite, and then some dogs started after us. So we're both running away as fast as we can, and I'm way ahead of him, and he's back there yelling at me, "Sister, wait for me." That's what he always called me, sister. And, just funny little moments like that you remember. But he was a really well-liked guy. At his funeral, we had the funeral at the largest funeral home in Bryan, and it was filled to overflowing because by this time he was working, and he had graduated with honors from Texas A&M University, and it was a huge loss for us and our family. And truthfully, our family dynamics were never the same because Donnie was the one that was always the center of starting something, and making us laugh or telling something or imitating somebody to the point that we were just rolling on the floor. So that's the kind of relationship and the kind of person he was.
Mm-hmm. So you had a close relationship, and that may have facilitated his ability to communicate with you, and certainly his motivation too. I'm remembering something we talked about yesterday, you and I, when we got together to prepare for the presentation, and I think it's worth talking about in terms of people who are grieving. That in my thinking, grieving involves 3 questions. One is where and how is the deceased? Another is how am I supposed to go on in life without them? And a third is what is our relationship now? Will we ever be connected again? And your experience answered at least the first 2 questions. You knew where and how he was. You knew that you were connected continually. And but it didn't entirely answer the question of how to go on without him. And you told me that the first day that you had the experience, you were still pretty overcome with the joy of it and so forth. But even by the next day, the reality of his absence came crashing in. And it really took you some time to integrate the experience into an ongoing sense of comfort and peace with his passing. And I wonder if you want to say anything else about that.
It's really true, though. I did fall back into very deep grieving the day after my experience. And in the book, I talk about a lot of my behavior in the years following that, and at some point having to feel as though I should pick up the pieces of my life and move on in a meaningful way. But even doing that, again, not talking to most people about that experience, you just go on marching through life and realizing, of course, that he was always around me and still is. I still find things that happen, things that are moved in my house, and I know it's him from the things that he moves or whatever. And so now, again, I have to go back to the fact that just sharing the story and really going back through with a perspective of 35 years ago, what I went through at his loss has brought about some healing for me. And I find that, yes, I still have my moments in recounting some of those dark, dark days, but I do feel much lighter in terms of my connection with him and feeling grateful for the fact that we had a life together.
Yeah, thank you. And I think this illustrates several things. For people to have realistic expectations about the effects of experiences like this, as profound as they are, as in some ways instantly transforming as they are, there are also some aspects of them that really require not only time, but as you said, the sharing process can really facilitate that integration and really mining from the experience the beneficial potential that it has for our well-being.
But as I've heard other people say so many times, people are afraid to say anything about that because people want to think there's something wrong with you,
Right.
or that you're still depressed, or you're imagining these things.
Yes, exactly.
So you just don't go there.
Yeah, exactly. And hopefully it's becoming more and more common knowledge that near-death experiences, after-death communication, and other spiritually transformative experiences are not particularly connected to mental illness. There's no real relationship there. That doesn't mean that people who are experiencing mental illness can't have these experiences, but most of the people who have them are not in a state of mental illness. So, was there any other question? We have time for one more, I think.
Okay. I am very happy to hear, was his name Lonnie?
Don.
Donnie had a...
But I always called him Donnie.
Okay.
Yes.
I am very happy to hear he's in a wonderful afterlife. That sounds great. But in here, I've been talking to a number of people in here, and their NDEs have been horrible and full of unconditional hate and unconditional fear, and they don't want to talk about it to anybody. And they don't want us to hear about it. Yes, we got to hear them. I am so grateful that your experiences were positive and Donnie's experiences are positive. I'm very happy for that. How about the lady with the purple? That purple thing may have been a sign that she had a hellish experience. I mean, she ended up living a positive, productive life after that, but we need to hear about all these experiences because a lot of people I've talked to in here have had those type. Okay, that.
Thank you. And I don't know if you want to say anything, but you're bringing up a really important point that as far as we know, maybe 10% of near-death experiences are distressing. They're dominated by feelings of terror, horror, guilt, emptiness, and it's a whole nother topic. We could be here easily for another hour to talk about those. But I will say that in my experience with distressing near-death experiencers, many times they come to the perspective that the experience was ultimately beneficial to them. And it's kind of like going through surgery. Who wants to do that? But it ends up being good for you. So that may not be the case for all people, but it is a theme that I've experienced a lot of times. So as I said, it's a whole other topic that we could spend a lot of time on. So, well, thank you very much for your attention. It's been great.